Canadians are reasonable and we are polite, but we will not back down from a fight. At the moment, the U.S. tariffs came into effect in the early hours of this morning.
For decades, Canada and the United States have maintained one of the world's most robust trade partnerships. But a seismic shift is now underway, one that has Washington scrambling for answers. Across Canadian grocery stores, liquor shops and shopping malls, made-in-Canada products are replacing American imports at an unprecedented rate. This isn't just a matter of national pride or economic policy. It's a deliberate financial counterstrike by Canada, reshaping the balance of power in North American trade. This is one story you wouldn't want to miss. It is happening now. Canada has shut down $302.47 billion US auto industry with this bold move. Let's get started. The financial knockout punch to the US economy. In response to the United States' imposition of a 25% tariff on all Canadian steel and aluminum products on March 12, 2025, Canada announced reciprocal tariffs totaling $29.8 billion. These measures included a 25% tariff on US steel products worth $12.6 billion, aluminum products worth $3 billion, and additional US goods worth $14.2 billion, encompassing tools, computers, servers, sports equipment, and cast iron products. Furthermore, Ontario introduced a 25% surcharge on electricity exports to United States jurisdictions, effective March 10, 2025. This surcharge was later suspended on March 11, 2025, following a directive from the Minister of Energy and Electrification. If this sounds bad, that is because it is. Actually, it is far worse than what it sounds. The US automotive sector, heavily reliant on Canadian steel and aluminum, has experienced increased production costs due to the tariffs. This escalation in costs is anticipated to lead to higher car prices for consumers. Automakers may also face challenges in sourcing materials, potentially disrupting production schedules and affecting employment within the industry. The construction industry is confronting rising costs for materials such as steel and aluminum. For instance, the Senior Centre project in Trumbull is expected to see increased construction costs due to the 25% tariffs on these imports. Such cost hikes could result in delays or cancellations of infrastructure projects, impacting employment and economic growth in the sector. Although the 25% surcharge on electricity exports from Ontario to the US was suspended shortly after its implementation, the initial announcement created uncertainty in the energy sector. This uncertainty could affect future energy trade agreements and investments, as stakeholders may be wary of potential policy reversals. The prevailing uncertainty stemming from these trade measures has been echoed by US companies. Firms such as General Motors and Rockwell Automation have expressed concerns about policy unpredictability under the current administration, leading to cautious approaches in investment and expansion plans. This sentiment is reflected in the stock market, with the S&P 500 index experiencing notable declines and 59 stocks hitting 52-week lows recently. The trade tensions have also influenced consumer behavior, particularly in the tourism sector. There has been a significant decline in the number of Canadians traveling to the US, with Statistics Canada reporting a 23% drop in Canadian drivers traveling to the US in February compared to the previous year. Major Canadian travel agency Flight Centre noted a 40% decrease in leisure bookings to the US. This downturn could result in substantial economic losses for the US tourism industry, with the US Travel Association predicting a potential $2.1 billion loss in spending and 14,000 job losses. The Bank of Canada has expressed concerns over tariff-induced inflation. The latest inflation report indicated a higher-than-expected rise to 2.6% in February. Despite 7 consecutive rate cuts, the Bank of Canada is expected to pause reductions due to concerns over accelerated inflation linked to tariffs. Governor Tiff Macklem emphasized the importance of controlling inflation expectations and preventing broader price increases due to tariffs. The severity of these actions suggests a potential escalation into a full-scale trade war. If additional tariffs are imposed or existing ones are increased, industries on both sides of the border could face further disruptions. The interconnected nature of the US and Canadian economies means that prolonged trade tensions could have widespread implications. So, can the United States win this trade war? Well, no. In fact, the push is coming a shove already. Fallout in US markets and industry. The recent escalation of trade tensions between Canada and the United States has sent shockwaves through US markets and industries, particularly the automotive sector. The imposition of tariffs and counter-tariffs has disrupted supply chains, increased production costs, and led to significant financial market reactions. The US automotive industry, for instance, which is heavily reliant on Canadian steel and aluminum, has been one of the hardest-hit sectors. Stock values for major automakers plummeted in the immediate aftermath of the tariff announcement, with Ford shares dropping by 7%, General Motors experiencing a 6.5% decline, and Stellantis, formerly Chrysler, losing 5.8% of its value. These losses reflect investor concerns about rising production costs, supply chain disruptions, and the potential for reduced vehicle sales due to increased consumer prices. The effects extend beyond Wall Street, as automakers are now grappling with significantly higher raw material costs. The 25% tariff on steel and aluminum imports has caused material expenses to surge, with analysts predicting that the cost of manufacturing vehicles could increase by as much as $4,000 to $5,000 per unit. The tariff-driven cost increases have placed enormous strain on US auto manufacturers, many of which operate on thin profit margins. Factories that depend on Canadian imports for raw materials are struggling to maintain production schedules, leading to significant delays and operational inefficiencies. Suppliers, too, are facing immense uncertainty as they attempt to navigate rising costs and logistical complexities. The disruption to the supply chain has forced some manufacturers to seek alternative sources of materials, a process that is both costly and time-consuming. As a result, the entire automotive ecosystem is experiencing turmoil, with ripple effects being felt across related industries such as transportation, logistics, and parts manufacturing. The US government was largely unprepared for the economic fallout caused by these trade measures. In Washington, D.C., lawmakers scrambled to respond, holding emergency meetings to assess the damage and formulate a plan of action. The Department of Commerce has highlighted the far-reaching impact of these trade policies. Experts within the administration have warned that prolonged tariffs could push the US manufacturing sector into a recession, with the automotive industry leading the downturn. Reports from economic advisors indicate that if these trade restrictions persist, the job market could suffer, with thousands of positions at risk due to decreased production capacity and shrinking profit margins. In response, the US government is considering countermeasures, including the possibility of imposing retaliatory tariffs on key Canadian exports such as agricultural products and consumer goods. However, such actions carry the risk of escalating tensions further, potentially leading to a full-blown trade war. And can the United States win such a trade war? Well, not if it is fighting with all of her allies at the same time, which is actually the case. Beyond the immediate impact on the automotive sector, the broader US economy is also facing significant challenges. The increase in material costs and supply chain disruptions has contributed to inflationary pressures, with the consumer price index expected to rise by 0.5% in the coming months due to tariff-induced price hikes. As production costs soar, the burden is ultimately passed on to consumers, who will have to pay more for a wide range of goods, including cars, household appliances, and construction materials. The decline in purchasing power could lead to shifts in consumer spending habits, further complicating the economic outlook. Other industries that rely on Canadian imports, such as aerospace and construction, are also feeling the effects of the tariffs. Aircraft manufacturers, for instance, have reported rising aluminum costs that threaten to increase production expenses for commercial and defense-related projects. The construction sector, which depends heavily on steel, is facing similar challenges, with infrastructure projects at risk of stalling due to escalating material prices. These disruptions have the potential to slow down economic growth, particularly in regions where manufacturing plays a central role in local economies. The financial markets have also been affected by the uncertainty surrounding trade policies. Major stock indices, including the S&P 500, have experienced increased volatility in response to trade news, with investors showing heightened caution. The prospect of prolonged trade disputes has created an atmosphere of unpredictability, discouraging capital investment in affected industries. As long as the trade tensions persist, financial markets are likely to remain unstable, with potential long-term consequences for economic growth and investor confidence. The escalating trade tensions between the United States and Canada have triggered immediate and severe challenges for US markets and industries. The automotive sector, in particular, faces higher production costs, supply chain disruptions, and declining stock values. The broader economic implications, including inflationary pressures and financial market volatility, highlight the far-reaching consequences of the current trade dispute. But now the question arises: why? Why did Canada take this drastic step? The imposition of tariffs, trade disputes, and protectionist policies under the new Trump administration have pushed Canada into a position where it felt compelled to take decisive action. While previous Canadian governments had exercised restraint in response to US trade measures, the latest round of economic pressure from Washington left Ottawa with no choice but to strike back. One of the primary factors behind Canada's drastic trade measures is the long-standing issue of US tariffs on key Canadian exports, including steel, aluminum, and dairy products. Over multiple administrations, the US has used tariffs as a tool to protect domestic industries, often at the expense of Canadian producers. The Trump administration, in particular, took an aggressive approach to trade, imposing a 25% tariff on Canadian steel and a 10% tariff on aluminum in 2018 under the guise of national security concerns. These tariffs severely disrupted Canadian industries, leading to job losses, reduced investment, and increased costs for manufacturers. Additionally, US protectionist policies in the dairy sector, including subsidies and quotas, created further imbalances, limiting market access for Canadian dairy farmers and fueling resentment within the Canadian agricultural industry. The effects of these policies were far-reaching. Canada initially sought diplomatic solutions, engaging in negotiations and leveraging the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or USMCA, to address some of these trade disputes. However, despite agreements being reached, the US continued to introduce policies that disadvantaged Canadian exporters. The Biden administration, while adopting a more cooperative tone, did little to reverse the structural disadvantages created by previous trade policies. With repeated instances of economic pressure from Washington, Canada's leaders began viewing trade retaliation as not just a necessary countermeasure, but a means to assert economic independence. The turning point came when Washington introduced new restrictions on Canadian energy exports and proposed tightening regulations on cross-border trade in response to domestic economic concerns. Canada, recognizing the pattern of economic coercion, opted for a bold response. The imposition of a 25% tariff on steel and aluminum exports to the US, alongside a 10% surcharge on energy exports, was designed to hit American industries where they are most vulnerable. But that's not all. Ottawa has also actively sought to diversify its trade partnerships, strengthening economic ties with Europe, Asia, and Latin America to reduce dependence on the US market. Recent trade agreements, such as the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, or CPTPP, and the Canada-European Union Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, or CETA, reflect this shift. By expanding trade relationships beyond North America, Canada aims to safeguard its economy against future US protectionist policies. This strategy also aligns with Canada's domestic economic agenda, which prioritizes strengthening manufacturing, supporting local industries, and fostering innovation in key sectors such as technology and renewable energy. Moreover, with rising nationalist sentiments in the US pushing for more protectionist policies, Canadian policymakers are under pressure to demonstrate strength in defending the country's economic interests, and the United States is taking a hit. A big hit: the disruption to the US auto industry. The US auto industry is facing an unprecedented crisis due to Canada's strategic trade measures, which have sent shockwaves through supply chains and manufacturing operations. For decades, American automakers have relied on Canadian steel, aluminum, and other raw materials to produce vehicles efficiently and cost-effectively. The integration between the two countries' automotive sectors is deeply rooted, with billions of dollars in trade flowing across the border each year. However, Canada's imposition of a 25% tariff on steel and aluminum exports to the US has thrown this relationship into turmoil, placing automakers in an impossible position. The ripple effects are expected to be severe, with rising costs, supply chain bottlenecks, and financial strain impacting both manufacturers and consumers. One of the most immediate and visible consequences of these tariffs is the expected rise in new car prices. The US auto industry imports approximately $12 billion worth of Canadian steel and aluminum annually, and with a 25% increase in costs, manufacturers must either absorb these expenses or pass them on to consumers. Analysts predict that vehicle prices could surge anywhere from $1,000 to $3,500 per car, and perhaps even more, depending on the make and model, making new vehicles less affordable for millions of Americans. This price hike extends beyond just luxury cars. Mass-market brands such as Ford, Chevrolet, and Chrysler, which cater to middle-class buyers, will also see price increases. The result could be a slowdown in new car sales, forcing automakers to re-evaluate production strategies and cut costs elsewhere, including through layoffs or plant closures. The impact of these tariffs is not limited to new car buyers. The leasing and used car markets will also feel the strain. Higher new car prices will make leasing more expensive, since lease agreements are based on a vehicle's depreciation and resale value. With increased production costs, manufacturers will set higher lease prices to compensate for their losses, making leasing less attractive for consumers. Additionally, as new car prices rise, demand for used cars is expected to skyrocket, driving up their prices as well. In an industry already dealing with supply chain issues and lingering effects from the COVID-19 pandemic, this additional pressure could make vehicle ownership increasingly unaffordable for many Americans. Automakers now face difficult decisions about how to manage these rising costs. One option is to absorb the additional costs internally, but this would place an enormous financial strain on companies already dealing with inflationary pressures and supply chain disruptions. General Motors, Ford, and Stellantis have all expressed concerns about profit margins shrinking if they are forced to shoulder these expenses. The alternative, which is passing the costs onto consumers, risks alienating buyers and reducing demand, creating a precarious balancing act for the industry. Some manufacturers may attempt to offset costs by sourcing materials from alternative suppliers, such as domestic or Asian producers, but this transition would take time and may not fully mitigate the financial impact. Perhaps the most alarming consequence of Canada's trade measures is the disruption to the supply chain, which could have long-term consequences for American car production. Canadian steel and aluminum are integral at multiple points in the manufacturing process, from body panels and engine components to structural reinforcements and safety features. The sudden imposition of tariffs means automakers must either pay the higher costs or scramble to find alternative suppliers. Any significant delays in securing raw materials could lead to production slowdowns, plant shutdowns, and inventory shortages at dealerships. This could further compound the crisis. The North American auto industry is deeply interconnected, with vehicles and parts often crossing the US-Canada border multiple times before reaching final assembly. This level of integration makes sudden trade disruptions particularly damaging. For example, a single Ford F-150 truck relies on materials and components sourced from both US and Canadian suppliers, meaning that a tariff on raw materials can have cascading effects throughout the entire production process. The crisis has already begun to show its effects on financial markets, with stock values for major automakers dropping in response to the uncertainty. Beyond the immediate financial consequences, this disruption raises broader questions about the future of the US auto industry. If Canadian tariffs remain in place, automakers may be forced to rethink their entire supply chain strategy, shifting production to alternative regions or investing in domestic manufacturing to mitigate reliance on Canadian materials. While such a transition would take years and require significant investment, it could ultimately reshape the auto industry in ways that extend far beyond this particular trade dispute. But what if things become even worse? The potential for an escalating trade war. Historically, the US has dictated the terms of trade with its northern neighbor, leveraging its larger economy and global influence. However, Canada's latest tariffs and trade restrictions have upended that dynamic, forcing American businesses and policymakers into a defensive stance. The stakes are high. One of the most immediate risks is that the US may retaliate with its own tariffs, targeting Canadian exports in an attempt to regain leverage. American businesses and trade associations are pressuring Washington to respond forcefully, arguing that failing to do so would set a dangerous precedent. The US government is now weighing potential countermeasures, including tariffs on Canadian lumber, agricultural products, and industrial goods, all of which would directly impact Canada's economy. However, this is not as simple as it sounds. You see, American consumers and businesses also rely heavily on these imports, meaning any retaliatory measures could end up hurting domestic industries just as much as they hurt Canada. One of the biggest concerns is the potential impact on energy prices in the US, as Canada's 10% surcharge on energy exports threatens to drive up costs for American consumers. Canada is the largest foreign supplier of crude oil and natural gas to the US, exporting more than 3.8 million barrels of oil per day, accounting for nearly 50% of US crude oil imports. With energy markets already experiencing volatility, even a modest price increase could have serious economic consequences. Gasoline prices, heating costs, and electricity rates could rise, placing additional financial burdens on households and businesses alike. The industrial sector, which relies on stable and affordable energy prices, could see higher operating costs, potentially leading to job losses. Beyond energy, the manufacturing and construction industries in the US are also facing mounting pressures due to the rising cost of Canadian steel and aluminum. The construction sector, which is already grappling with material shortages and inflation-driven cost increases, will see prices for key materials like rebar, beams, and sheet metal continue to climb. This could slow down infrastructure projects, drive up housing costs, and make commercial developments more expensive. In the manufacturing sector, industries such as aerospace, machinery, and consumer goods production all depend on Canadian metals, meaning higher costs will inevitably lead to price increases for a wide range of products. The result could be a slowdown in economic growth as businesses and consumers alike struggle. Perhaps the most concerning aspect of this trade conflict is that Canada may not stop here. Ottawa's initial round of tariffs and surcharges was a carefully calculated move designed to maximize economic pain for the US while minimizing damage to its own industries. However, if Washington retaliates, Canada has the option to impose additional economic countermeasures, escalating the conflict further. Potential next steps could include restrictions on agricultural exports, limiting the flow of essential food products such as wheat, beef, and dairy into the US. Canada could also explore regulatory barriers on American businesses operating within its borders, increasing compliance costs for US firms and reducing their competitive advantage in Canadian markets. The longer this dispute drags on, the greater the risk of severe and lasting economic damage on both sides of the border. Trade wars have historically proven to be economically destructive, disrupting supply chains, reducing market stability, and creating uncertainty that discourages investment. But wait, aren't we missing something? The people? How does all of this affect them? The bigger picture, what this means for consumers. The consequences of Canada's economic countermeasures will be felt directly by the average US consumer, with rising prices, job market instability, and increased financial strain becoming unavoidable realities. The most immediate and noticeable effect will be the rise in car prices. As the automotive industry grapples with skyrocketing material costs due to tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, with major US automakers like Ford, GM, and Chrysler already warning of price hikes, consumers looking to buy a new car may face thousands of dollars in additional costs. At the same time, the used car market could see inflationary pressure, as higher new car prices drive more buyers toward pre-owned vehicles, increasing demand and pushing prices up. The cost of everyday goods is also set to rise, as Canadian raw materials play a crucial role in the manufacturing of countless products. Everything from household appliances to construction materials, electronics, and even packaged foods could see price hikes. The construction industry, in particular, will face added challenges, with the price of new homes and commercial buildings increasing due to the rising cost of Canadian lumber and metal imports. The impact on housing could be severe, making home ownership even more unattainable for many Americans who are already struggling with high mortgage rates and record housing prices. Then there's the threat of job losses, especially in industries that rely heavily on trade with Canada. Manufacturing, auto production, construction, and energy sectors could all see cutbacks as businesses reduce hiring, delay projects, or even lay off workers in response to rising costs. With economic uncertainty looming, companies may also be hesitant to invest in expansion or new projects, leading to a slowdown in job creation across multiple industries. If tensions continue to escalate, supply chain disruptions could force temporary or permanent factory closures, leaving thousands of workers unemployed. There's also the increased cost of transportation, which serves as the backbone of the US economy. As fuel prices climb, thanks to retaliatory tariffs, shipping and logistics companies face significantly higher operational expenses, which they, in turn, pass on to retailers and manufacturers. This means that nearly every consumer good, from groceries to household essentials, electronics, and clothing, will see price hikes as companies struggle to offset the rising cost of moving goods across the country. For middle and lower income Americans who are already dealing with inflationary pressures, this compounds financial strain, making everyday necessities more expensive and reducing their purchasing power. The agriculture sector is also being hit hard, as farms rely heavily on fuel for machinery, irrigation systems, and transportation of crops and livestock. Higher fuel prices translate directly into rising production costs, which inevitably lead to higher food prices at grocery stores. Items such as wheat, corn, dairy, and meat products are particularly vulnerable, as their production and distribution are energy-intensive processes. Air travel is another major casualty of the energy crisis. As airlines face skyrocketing fuel costs, they have no choice but to raise ticket prices. This makes both business and leisure travel less affordable, reducing overall passenger demand and forcing airlines to cut routes, reduce flights, or increase fees for services like checked baggage. In an era where air travel is essential for business connectivity and tourism, these rising costs could hurt the broader economy. For the average American consumer, a trade war is simply a disaster. Naturally, the United States is concerned, deeply concerned. Washington is in crisis mode. The escalating trade crisis has naturally thrown Washington into full-blown emergency mode, as lawmakers scramble to respond to the economic shockwaves reverberating through the country. The severity of the situation has forced a series of urgent, high-level meetings, with top officials from the White House, Congress, and economic advisory teams convening to assess the fallout and strategize a response. The dilemma facing policymakers is deeply divisive. Some argue for immediate de-escalation to stabilize the economy and prevent further damage, while others insist that backing down would signal weakness and encourage further economic pressure from Canada and other trading partners. Even within the ruling Republican Party, the crisis has sparked a battle between economic nationalists and pro-business conservatives. Some Republicans argue that standing firm against Canada is essential to projecting American strength, even at the cost of economic hardship. Others, particularly those with strong ties to corporate America, fear that prolonged trade tensions will only exacerbate inflation, hurt businesses, and alienate voters. For now, Washington remains in crisis mode, with policymakers, business leaders, and state officials engaged in frantic negotiations to find a solution. Whether the US government chooses to de-escalate or retaliate will have profound implications, not just for the economy and trade relations with Canada, but for the political future of the country. With each passing day, the stakes grow higher, and the pressure to act becomes more urgent than ever. Washington can simply no longer afford to stand idle. The warnings from industry leaders are no longer hypothetical. Layoff preparations are underway, with thousands of workers at risk of losing their jobs if Washington fails to intervene. But there's another, much bigger cost for America. While the economic costs of this crisis are staggering, the geopolitical consequences for the United States may be even more severe. As Washington struggles to contain the fallout, its global rivals are watching and capitalizing. The breakdown of trade relations between the US and Canada has created an opening for China and other global players to step in and reshape the balance of power in international trade. As US-Canada trade tensions escalate, Beijing is positioning itself as an attractive alternative partner for Ottawa. Canada, now faced with rising costs and uncertainty from its southern neighbor, may look toward China for expanded trade agreements and investments. Chinese firms could offer competitive deals on steel, aluminum, and other crucial resources, undermining America's influence in the North American market. This would be a major geopolitical victory, one that would allow Beijing to weaken US dominance in the region while securing new supply chains for its own industries. The broader geopolitical implications extend far beyond trade agreements. America's handling of this crisis will be closely scrutinized by allies and adversaries alike. If Washington appears weak, divided, or slow to act, it risks losing credibility on the world stage. Other nations may begin questioning US leadership in global economic affairs, leading to a decline in American influence in international organizations such as the World Trade Organization and G7. Meanwhile, countries that have traditionally aligned with the US on trade policy may start exploring new alliances that offer greater economic security. At home, the geopolitical stakes are just as high. If Washington allows this crisis to spiral out of control, it could fuel nationalist movements and protectionist policies, further isolating the US from global trade networks. This could lead to a long-term economic decline as other nations move ahead with multilateral trade agreements that exclude the United States. Such an outcome would mark a significant shift in global economic power, one that could take decades to reverse. This trade war is truly a turning point in America's role in the global economy. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Did you like this video? If you did, please consider liking, dropping a comment, and hitting the subscribe button so that you don't miss out on our new uploads. Also, don't miss this video you see on your screen right now. It's truly unbelievable.